He thought humiliating her would make him look powerful, but he had no idea he had just stepped into a moment that would strip that power away in seconds, and everyone watching would remember it. The late afternoon sun spilled across the polished stone floor of the upscale outdoor shopping plaza, the kind of place where everything gleamed just a little brighter and everyone walked just a little slower, as if time itself respected the price tags around them. And right in the center of it all stood Brandon Hayes, loud, confident, wrapped in a tailored navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, laughing just a little too hard at his own jokes while a small circle of onlookers lingered nearby, drawn not by admiration but by the gravity of his presence, the kind of presence that demanded attention whether you wanted to give it or not. And then there was Emily Carter, standing a few feet away near a boutique window, her reflection faint against the glass, dressed in a simple gray cardigan and worn jeans, the kind of outfit that blended into the background so completely that most people never noticed it at all. And that was exactly why Brandon noticed her. It started small, the way these things always do. A glance, a smirk, a quick comment tossed into the air like it didn't matter. "You look lost," he said, his voice carrying just enough to turn a few heads. And Emily didn't respond. Not at first, her posture calm, her eyes steady, as if she had already heard 1,000 versions of that same sentence in 1,000 different places. But Brandon wasn't used to being ignored. Not here, not ever. So he stepped closer, closing the space between them with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been told no. "Seriously," he added, louder this time. "This isn't exactly a thrift store." A couple of people nearby chuckled, not because it was funny, but because laughter felt safer than silence when someone like Brandon was performing. And just like that, the moment shifted, the invisible line between passing comment and public spectacle quietly erased. Phones subtly lifted, eyes sharpened, the air tightening with anticipation, because people sensed what was coming even if they didn't say it out loud, and Brandon leaned into it, feeding off the attention, his confidence swelling. As the crowd gave him exactly what he wanted, a stage, he continued, circling slightly as if positioning himself for a better angle. "There's a coffee shop down the street, probably more your speed." The words landed heavier now, not just dismissive but deliberate, crafted to sting, crafted to entertain. And still, Emily didn't react the way he expected. No flinch, no argument, no apology. Just a slow, measured breath as her gaze lifted from the ground to meet his for the first time. And something in that moment changed, subtle but undeniable. The kind of shift you don't notice until it's already too late. Because while Brandon saw a quiet woman standing alone, what he failed to see was the stillness behind her eyes, the control in her posture, the kind of composure that doesn't come from weakness, but from knowing exactly how much strength you're holding back. And for a brief second, the laughter around them faltered, not gone, but thinner, uncertain, like the room itself was beginning to question whether this was going to play out the way everyone expected. And Brandon, still smiling, still certain, took one more step forward, unaware that he had just crossed into a moment he wouldn't be able to walk back from. Brandon's smile lingered, but there was a flicker beneath it now, something subtle that most people would miss, because Emily Carter did not look away when their eyes met, and that alone disrupted the rhythm he was used to controlling, the unspoken script where his words landed and others reacted on cue, because instead of shrinking or stepping back, she simply stood there, steady, composed, her voice quiet when she finally spoke. "I am not lost." And the simplicity of it hung in the air longer than expected, not sharp, not defensive, just certain, and that certainty made a few people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. But Brandon recovered quickly, as people like him always did, doubling down instead of stepping back. "Then you are in the wrong place on purpose," he replied, letting out a short laugh that echoed louder than it needed to. And again the crowd followed, some smiling, others pretending not to watch while watching anyway, and the plaza, once filled with casual conversation, and the soft hum of music from nearby stores, began to narrow into a single point of focus, the kind of moment where everything else fades and only one interaction matters. And Brandon leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal, but still loud enough for others to hear. "Places like this are for people who know how to carry themselves," he said, his eyes briefly scanning her clothes again as if they were evidence in a case he had already decided. And Emily listened without interruption, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed, as though none of this surprised her, as though she had seen this pattern before and already knew how it ended. And that calmness, that lack of reaction, began to create a different kind of tension, one that did not feed Brandon's energy the way he expected, because there was no resistance to push against, no embarrassment to amplify, only stillness. And stillness does something strange in a public moment. It forces people to pay closer attention. And one by one, the laughter thinned, replaced by quiet observation, the kind that makes people lower their phones just a fraction, unsure if they are witnessing something ordinary or something they will talk about later. And Brandon felt it. Even if he did not fully understand it, the subtle shift in control, the way the moment was no longer entirely his. And so he tried to reclaim it, straightening his posture, raising his voice again. "You should take the hint," he added, gesturing vaguely toward the edge of the plaza, as if dismissing her from a space he did not own but believed he did. And that was when something changed in Emily, not dramatically, not in a way that called attention to itself, but in a way that altered the air around her, her head tilting slightly, her gaze steady, her expression no longer just calm but focused, deliberate, as if she had reached a quiet decision. And for the first time since the exchange began, Brandon hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of hesitation that slips through before pride can cover it. Because something about her composure did not match the role he had assigned her, and the crowd felt it too. That almost imperceptible pause where the energy shifted from amusement to anticipation, where people stopped reacting and started watching. Because somewhere beneath the surface of that simple moment, it was becoming clear that this was no longer about a joke, and whatever was about to happen next would not follow the script Brandon had in mind. The silence stretched just long enough to make Brandon uncomfortable, not visibly at first, but in the way his shoulders stiffened and his smile tightened at the edges, because he was not used to moments that did not bend around him. And Emily did not move, did not retreat, did not offer him the reaction he was waiting for. Instead, she took a single, slow step forward, closing the distance he had created, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with a quiet certainty that shifted the balance in a way words never could. And when she spoke again, her voice was still calm, still measured, but now there was something else beneath it, something grounded, something that carried weight without needing volume. "You are very sure of yourself," she said, and the words were not an insult, not even a challenge, but an observation, the kind that forces a person to hear themselves more clearly than they intended. And for a brief second Brandon laughed again, but this time it did not land. The same, the sound slightly off, as if even he could hear the difference. "Of course I am," he replied, lifting his chin, trying to re-establish the rhythm he had lost. "That is what happens when you belong somewhere." And there it was again, that word, belong, hanging between them like an invisible boundary he believed he had the authority to draw. And a few people in the crowd exchanged glances, because now it was no longer just a joke. It was something sharper, something more revealing. And Emily's gaze did not waver, her expression unchanged except for the faintest shift in her eyes, a clarity that had not been there before, as if she had finished assessing everything she needed to understand about him. The tone, the posture, the assumptions, all of it laid bare in front of her. And then she did something unexpected. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply reached into her bag with deliberate calm, her movements unhurried, precise, and that alone caused the crowd to lean in slightly, curiosity replacing amusement, because this was not how these moments usually unfolded. And Brandon watched her with a hint of confusion now, his confidence still present, but no longer absolute. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice carrying a trace of impatience, as if he needed the moment to return to something he could control. And Emily did not answer right away. Instead, she pulled out a small, simple item, something unremarkable at first glance, holding it lightly in her hand as she looked back up at him. And when she spoke again, her tone remained steady, but the words carried a quiet precision that cut deeper than anything louder ever could. "You keep talking about belonging," she said, pausing just enough to let the words settle. "But you have not asked a single question." And the crowd stilled, because now the shift was undeniable. The energy no longer centered on Brandon's performance, but on Emily's presence. The way she held the moment without raising her voice, without demanding attention, and Brandon frowned slightly, not understanding why the situation felt different, why the ground beneath his confidence seemed less stable. "I do not need to ask questions," he said quickly, trying to regain footing. "Some things are obvious." And Emily nodded once, a small acknowledgement that somehow carried more weight than agreement. And then she tilted her head just slightly, her eyes steady on his, and said, "That is usually when people are the most wrong." And this time, no one laughed. The plaza fell into a quiet that felt heavier than before, a hush that did not come from fear but from realization. Because something had changed, something irreversible. And for the first time since this began, Brandon Hayes had no immediate response. His words caught somewhere between certainty and doubt, and the moment, no longer his, slipped quietly out of his control. Brandon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as the silence around him grew heavier, the kind of silence that did not just listen but judged. And for the first time the attention he had drawn no longer felt like control, but pressure, pressing in from all sides, because the crowd was no longer reacting to him. They were watching her. And that shift unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. So he did what he had always done when control slipped. He pushed harder, forcing a short laugh that sounded sharper than before. "You think you are making a point," he said, his voice rising slightly. "But you are just avoiding the obvious." And he gestured again toward her clothes, toward the simplicity he had already decided defined her. "People who belong here do not have to explain themselves." And the words landed, but not with the same effect, because now they sounded less like confidence and more like insistence, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. And Emily watched him steadily, her expression unchanged, her grip still relaxed around the small item in her hand. And then she did something that no one expected. She smiled, not in mockery, not in defiance, but in quiet understanding, the kind of smile that comes when someone has seen the pattern before and already knows how it ends. And that smile unsettled Brandon more than any argument could have, because it suggested that whatever he thought was happening, she was several steps ahead of it. "You are right about one thing," she said softly, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension without needing to rise. "People who belong do not need to explain themselves." And for a brief moment Brandon's expression shifted, a flicker of validation crossing his face as if he had regained ground. But it vanished just as quickly as she continued. "But they also do not need to prove it by tearing someone else down." And the words landed differently, not loud, not aggressive, but precise, and the crowd felt it. A subtle intake of breath passing through the space as the meaning settled, because what had started as a spectacle was now becoming something else entirely, something quieter but far more powerful. And Brandon's confidence wavered again, his posture stiffening as he searched for a response that would restore the dynamic he had lost. "You are overthinking this," he said quickly, though the certainty in his voice was thinner now. "This is not that deep." And Emily tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his, as if measuring not just his words but the space between them. And then she finally raised the object in her hand just enough for him to see it clearly, still not dramatic, still not rushed, just deliberate. And though it was small, unassuming, the way she held it carried weight, the kind that comes from knowing exactly when a moment is about to turn. And Brandon's gaze dropped to it instinctively, curiosity breaking through his frustration. And around them, the crowd leaned in again, drawn not by noise but by anticipation, because the energy had shifted once more, the kind of shift that only happens when something hidden is about to be revealed. And Emily's voice remained calm as she spoke, each word placed carefully. "You decided who I was the second you saw me," she said, pausing just enough to let the truth of it settle into the air. "And you built everything else on that." And Brandon opened his mouth to respond, but no words came immediately, because for the first time he was not reacting from confidence, he was reacting from uncertainty. And in that hesitation, that brief, unguarded moment, the entire dynamic between them changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And the plaza, once filled with casual noise and passing attention, fell into a stillness that made every second feel longer, because everyone watching could sense it now. The moment right before everything shifts, the moment where assumptions break and reality steps in, and Brandon Hayes, standing in the center of it all, no longer looked like the one in control. For a moment, Brandon just stared at the object in her hand, his mind trying to catch up with a situation that no longer followed his expectations, because whatever he thought this was, it was no longer simple, and the confidence that had carried him through the entire exchange now felt thinner, stretched across a reality he did not fully understand. "What is that supposed to prove?" he asked, his voice sharper now, not louder, but edged with something closer to defensiveness than authority. And Emily did not rush to answer. She never did. Instead, she let the silence settle again. That same controlled pause that seemed to shift the weight of the moment every time she used it. And when she finally spoke, her tone remained even, almost gentle, but unmistakably firm. "It is not about proving anything," she said, her gaze steady on his. "It is about correcting what you assumed." And with that, she turned the object slightly, just enough for him to see it clearly, and for a brief second, his expression did not change, as if his mind rejected what his eyes were telling him, because the small, simple item he had dismissed without thought was not ordinary at all. It carried a meaning he had not considered, one that immediately reframed the entire situation, and the shift was instant, subtle, but undeniable, like a crack forming in something that had seemed solid just seconds before, and the crowd felt it too, a ripple of quiet recognition passing through those close enough to see, phones lowering, expressions tightening, because the narrative they had been following was no longer holding together, and Brandon blinked once, then again, as if trying to reset the moment, but there was no reset, only realization creeping in, slow and uncomfortable. "That does not change anything," he said quickly, though the conviction in his voice was no longer as strong, and Emily's expression softened just slightly, not in sympathy, but in understanding, as if she had been expecting that response. "It changes everything," she replied, not louder, not forceful, just certain, and that certainty carried more weight than any argument could have, because it was grounded in truth, not performance. And Brandon shifted his stance, his hands no longer as relaxed at his sides, his posture no longer as effortless, because now he was aware of the eyes around him in a different way, not as an audience to impress, but as witnesses to something slipping out of his control, and the silence that followed was no longer passive. It was active, pressing, demanding, and Emily took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space. The kind of space that makes a moment clearer rather than weaker, and she looked at him for one more second, long enough for the realization to fully settle in, before speaking again, her voice calm, her words precise. "You saw what you wanted to see," she said, "and you decided the rest without knowing anything at all." And this time, Brandon did not interrupt. He could not, because the truth of it had already reached him, already begun to unravel the certainty he had been standing on, and around them. The plaza had gone completely still, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that comes when people recognize a mistake unfolding in real time. And Brandon Hayes, who had started this moment so sure of himself, now stood there searching for something to say, something to reclaim the ground he had lost, but the words did not come as easily as they had before, and for the first time since he had spoken, he looked unsure, and everyone could see it. The weight of the moment settled fully now, not in a sudden crash, but in a slow, undeniable shift that left no room for denial. And Brandon could feel it in the way the air around him had changed, the way the quiet no longer belonged to him but pressed against him, exposing every word he had spoken just minutes before. And for the first time he glanced around, really looked at the faces that had once fed his confidence. And what he saw there was not admiration or amusement, but something else. Entirely, something closer to discomfort, to judgment, to the quiet realization that they had witnessed something unfold that could not be undone. And that realization unsettled him more than anything Emily had said, because it meant the narrative he had been controlling was no longer his to shape. "Look," he started, his voice lower now, less certain, as if searching for a version of himself that fit the new reality. "This is getting blown out of proportion." And the words felt hollow even as he said them, because no one moved, no one laughed, no one gave him the reaction he needed to make that statement true. and Emily watched him with the same steady composure, her expression neither harsh nor forgiving, simply clear, as if she was allowing him the space to hear himself, to recognize the distance between who he thought he was and what he had just shown, and that space, that silence, forced him into something unfamiliar. Reflection, even if only for a moment, and he shifted his weight again, his posture no longer confident but restless, his hands moving slightly as if unsure where to settle. I did not mean anything by it, he added, a phrase that sounded more like an excuse than an explanation, and Emily's gaze softened just slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding of the pattern, because she had heard those words before, in different places, from different people, always after the moment had already revealed too much, and she nodded once, a small acknowledgement that seemed to accept the statement without validating it. That is usually how it sounds afterward, she said quietly, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any accusation could have, because it did not attack him. It simply reflected the truth back to him, and Brandon exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders no longer hidden, because now he understood that there was no easy way to step out of this, no quick remark that would restore the version of himself he had been projecting, and the crowd remained still, not out of obligation, but because they recognized that something real was happening, something that did not need noise to be powerful. And Emily lowered her hand, the object no longer the focus, because it had already served its purpose, and what remained now was not proof but perspective, and she took a small step to the side, creating just enough distance to signal that she was no longer engaging in the same way, that the moment had shifted beyond confrontation into something quieter, more final, and when she spoke again her voice was calm, steady, carrying the kind of clarity that does not demand attention but commands it anyway. You did not see me, she said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. You saw an idea of me. And Brandon's eyes dropped for a brief second, not out of defeat, but out of recognition, because there was no arguing with that. Not now, not here, and the plaza, once filled with casual movement and passing noise, held on to the silence just a little longer, as if even the space itself understood that this moment, simple as it seemed, had changed something in a way that could not be reversed. And Brandon Hayes, standing in the center of it all, no longer looked like someone in control, but like someone who had just realized exactly what he had revealed. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like tension releasing from a space that had held too much for too long, and Brandon remained where he stood, but something in him had shifted in a way that could not be hidden anymore, because the version of himself he had been presenting had cracked, and now what remained was far less certain, far less controlled, and he knew it. He could feel it in the way people were no longer looking at him with passive interest, but with quiet evaluation, the kind that lingers long after a moment has passed, and Emily did not need to say anything else to make that clear, because what needed to be understood had already been revealed, and she turned slightly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that she was done with the exchange, that the moment no longer required her presence to continue. And that was what unsettled Brandon the most, not confrontation, not words, but the absence of both, because without her engagement, there was nothing left for him to push against, nothing left to control, only the reality of what had already happened, and he shifted. Again, his voice returning, but this time it lacked the sharpness it once carried. So that is it, he said, attempting something close to casual, though it did not quite land. You just walk away. And Emily paused, not turning back immediately, giving the question just enough space to exist before acknowledging it. And when she did turn, her expression was calm, unchanged, but there was a quiet finality in her eyes now, the kind that does not invite further discussion. There is nothing left to say, she replied, and the simplicity of it settled over the crowd like a closing statement, not dramatic, not forceful, but complete. And Brandon let out a short breath, something between a laugh and an exhale, but it carried none of the confidence from before, because even he could hear the difference now, the way his voice no longer held authority but reaction, and he glanced around again, searching for someone to meet his gaze, someone to restore the dynamic he had lost, but no one stepped forward, no one offered him the reassurance he had once taken for granted, and in that absence, The reality of the moment became unavoidable, because there was no audience left for his performance, only witnesses to his misjudgment, and Emily gave a small nod, not to him specifically, but to the moment itself, as if acknowledging its end, and then she turned fully, beginning to walk away with the same steady composure she had carried from the beginning, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, and no one stopped her, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to interrupt, and Brandon watched her go, his expression no longer confident, no longer certain, but something quieter, something closer to reflection than reaction, and the crowd began to shift again, movement returning in small, uncertain ways, conversations resuming in lower tones, phones lowering completely, because whatever they had expected to witness had not played out the way they thought, and that difference lingered in the air, and Brandon remained there for a moment longer, standing in the space where his certainty had once been, now left with something far less comfortable, something that did not fade as quickly as the attention had, because the kind of realization that comes without warning does not leave as easily as it arrives, and for the first time that day, Brandon Hayes did not look like someone who belonged at the center of the moment, but like someone who had just learned what happens when you mistake confidence for understanding. Emily's footsteps were quiet against the smooth stone as she moved through the plaza, steady and unhurried, as if the moment behind her had already been filed away, resolved, no longer needing her attention. And yet the air she left behind still carried the weight of what had just happened, because some moments do not end when the words stop. They linger, settling into the space, into the people who witnessed them, into the one who caused them, and Brandon remained exactly where she had left him, his gaze following her for a second longer than he intended before he finally looked away, not because he was finished with the moment, but because he could feel the eyes around him in a way he had not before, not as admiration, not as entertainment, but as quiet recognition, and that recognition made it impossible to return to who he had been just minutes ago, because now every word he had said echoed differently, stripped of the confidence that had once carried them, and replaced with something far less comfortable, something closer to exposure, and the people nearby began to move again, slowly at first, as if unsure whether the moment had truly ended, conversations restarting in low tones, glances exchanged, subtle but telling, because even without speaking, everyone understood that something had shifted, and Brandon adjusted his jacket, a small, automatic gesture, but it lacked the ease it once had, his movements now more deliberate, more aware, as if he was trying to reassemble a version of himself that no longer fit the situation, and one of the onlookers, a man who had been standing near the edge of the crowd, gave him a brief look, not hostile, not confrontational, just honest. The kind of look that does not linger but says enough in a single second, and Brandon looked away from it almost immediately, because it was easier not to meet that kind of reflection directly, and he took a step back, then another, creating distance from the center of the moment he had once occupied so easily, and for the first time, the space felt larger than it had before, not because anything had physically changed, but because his place within it had, and across the plaza, Emily reached the edge of the walkway, pausing briefly as she adjusted the strap of her bag, her posture still calm, her expression unchanged, and she did not look back, not out of indifference, but because she did not need to, because whatever had needed to be said had already been said, not through force, not through argument, but through clarity, and that clarity had done what noise never could. It had revealed something, and once something is revealed, it cannot be unseen, and Brandon stood there for a moment longer, his thoughts quieter now, no longer racing to defend or respond, but settling into something slower, something heavier, because the kind of realization that comes without warning does not disappear quickly. It stays, reshaping how a moment is remembered, how a person is seen, and as the plaza returned to its usual rhythm, the soft music, the distant conversations, the movement of people passing through, there was still a trace of what had happened, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that would fade with time but not completely disappear, because moments like that leave something behind, not visible, not loud, but present, and Brandon Hayes, who had entered that moment certain of who he was, now stood in its aftermath understanding something he had not considered before, that certainty built on assumptions is fragile, and once it breaks, it does not come back the same way again. The plaza carried on as if nothing had happened, but for those who had witnessed it, something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but stays, lingering quietly in the way people looked at one another, in the way a simple moment could suddenly feel heavier with meaning. And Brandon finally moved, not with the same easy confidence he had before, but with a measured pace that suggested he was no longer performing for anyone, his steps slower, his posture less certain, as if each movement now required thought instead of instinct. And he adjusted his sleeve again, a small gesture that once signaled control but now felt more like habit, something automatic in a moment where nothing else felt automatic anymore. And as he walked, he passed by the same storefront windows that had reflected him earlier. But this time he did not glance at them, did not check the image he had once been so sure of, because somewhere in the back of his mind, he understood that the reflection would not match the version he had been projecting, not anymore. And behind him, the crowd had fully dispersed, conversations returning to normal, laughter resurfacing in fragments, but softer now, less careless, as if the moment had reminded them of something they had not considered before, something about how quickly a situation can turn, how easily assumptions can collapse under the weight of truth. And across the plaza, Emily continued walking, her pace unchanged, her presence blending back into the flow of people as naturally as it had existed within it before, and there was no trace of triumph in her expression, no need to revisit what had happened, because for her, the moment had never been about winning. It had been about clarity, about allowing something to reveal itself without force, and once it had, there was nothing left to hold on to, and she paused briefly near the edge of the street, waiting for the signal to change, the late afternoon light catching the edges of her hair as she stood there among strangers who had no idea what had just unfolded minutes before, and that contrast, that quiet return to normalcy, made the moment feel even more significant, because it proved that something meaningful does not always need to be loud to leave an impact. And Brandon, now farther away, slowed near the entrance of the plaza, his gaze drifting for a second as if searching for something he could not quite define. And though he did not turn back, the weight of what had happened followed him, not as embarrassment alone, but as realization, the kind that does not fade quickly, the kind that settles into a person and quietly reshapes the way they see the next moment. And the people who had witnessed it carried a piece of it with them too, not in words, not in retelling, but in awareness, because once you see the difference between confidence and understanding, between noise and presence, you do not forget it easily. And as the traffic light changed and Emily stepped forward, crossing into the next block without hesitation, the plaza behind her returned to its usual rhythm completely. But the lesson of that moment remained, not spoken, not explained, just understood, that the people you overlook are often the ones who do not need to prove anything at all. And that day, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, she had shown exactly what quiet strength looks like, and the space she left behind carried that truth long after she was gone.